to Asian American and Activate California and the work that we're doing in AAPI communities.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We're excited to welcome you today and to hear your questions, learn your thoughts. I'm just going to briefly introduce Asian American Futures. Our mission is ensuring that AA and HPI communities are seen, heard, empowered, and united. Asian American Futures focuses on three main areas of work: investments in small and emerging grassroots organizations that are working with diverse and often marginalized communities, including through programs that support their efforts to move policy and narrative; engaging millennial and Gen Z community members in political education; and experimenting with narrative to support stories that tell our stories and move us to work in solidarity with communities of color for a better future for all of us. We're really excited to share this research today. It's innovative, and I think hopefully will really give you food for thought to think about your audiences and the direction that you plan to move your work. So welcome. And looking forward to learning more from you as well. So I'll turn it over to you, Jonathan.
Thanks, Reshma. Echoing a lot of what Reshma described for both our organizations, Activate California is actually a program within Asian American Futures. And I just want to take a moment to give some context as to why we're talking about millennials and Gen Zs. So on the next slide, the reality is that within the Asian American community, especially here in California, millennials, Gen Z, and Gen Alpha already make up the plurality of our communities. But what that hasn't translated to is tangible political power and the ability to influence the outcomes for our communities. So we're really excited about you joining us for today's conversation, because it gives us an opportunity to really dive into it and explore what those elements look like. On the next slide, I just want to do a quick shout out to a lot of the partners that we have in California, both through Activate California, Asian American Futures. We're a grant-making entity in addition to doing the work of supporting millennial and Gen Z organizations. So really excited for today's conversation. We invite you all to make as many comments and ask questions as possible. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to the start of the show, Kana.
And actually, Kana, if you don't mind, we should introduce ourselves. I'm the Executive Director of Asian American Futures. Jonathan is the Director of Activate California, and Kana is our narrative strategist.
Thank you, Reshma and Jonathan, for introducing us. Again, we're so excited to see so many faces here, some who we know very well and some who we are just getting to meet for the first time today. So thank you so much for your curiosity and for being here. So we want to share more about the research that we did, but first, to set the stage, I was hoping you all could rewind back with me to AAPI Heritage Month in May 2021, where a group of my friends, most of us were Asian American, had gathered to watch and discuss the PBS Asian American series on Zoom. And as we were discussing and watching together, we noticed some differences. We knew and really wanted to be telling different stories about Asian American communities and AAPI communities as a whole. And the PBS series was just a start. But we couldn't really agree on what those stories should be or how we should be telling them. I'll give you some examples. So one friend, they deeply felt the pain of the attacks on elders and the murders in Atlanta. They were going to rallies, they were volunteering at self-defense workshops, they were sharing videos on social media, and they really were concerned that not many people outside of our community was aware of how close to home this was hitting. I had another friend who was a descendant of Japanese American incarceration survivors. They were involved in Nikkei abolition efforts and advocating for cross-racial solidarity. And then there was a friend who almost changed their name after 9/11 because being a South Asian person made them feel like a target. And why, they wondered, were people just waking up to anti-Asian violence? And these differences were surprising based on the ways that we typically segment people in our community, which is by ethnicity, right? Obviously, we're not a monolith. You all know that. But our demographic and ethnic differences couldn't explain these differences in perspectives. We had a lot of different ethnicities represented, immigration stories, generations, class backgrounds, faiths, genders, but our differences didn't fall solely on those lines either. And I couldn't explain it then, but I was really, really curious. And I was really excited to see that even if we couldn't agree always on how to show up or what to say, we all wanted to see a different future for AAPI communities, and we were willing to use our voices and speak up to help us get there. And it turns out we weren't alone, both in our curiosity or our desire and commitment to seeing something different. The more time I spent listening and observing to AAPI America, the more I was convinced that we were at a really special inflection point, both culturally, politically, and socially. And on one hand, there's a lot of hope because ideas like solidarity, community care, they were coming to the forefront. Native Hawaiian and Pacifica people were finally getting the leadership and attention that they've long deserved. And we have movie stars, right? We just cleaned up at the Oscars last weekend, podcasts, best-selling authors. The narratives about our community are beginning to shift for the better. But beneath the surface, sometimes in pretty visible ways, we know that the harmful narratives have shaped the way our community has been seen and how we see ourselves. And I'm not just talking about the model minority and the perpetual foreigner, but deep narratives about assimilation and scarcity that have led people in our own community to aspire to whiteness and to lean into anti-Blackness. And these ideas hold a lot of power, even if most of us poll liberal or vote for Democrats. And after all my research, I'm really convinced that if we're going to tell different stories about our communities, we need to transform the fear and the scarcity and curiosity that people are feeling into a stronger sense of pride, love, and power. And when we do this, we have a chance of building narrative power for a powerful AAPI majority. If we want new stories to stick, we need to focus on changing the culture in which we're immersed. We can't just stop at one policy or one story, or just rely on representation. We want to be in control of the stories told by us, for us, and about us, and nothing changes unless the narrative changes. And we know how transformative narrative power has been for social movements because we have many examples of this from history. How Love is Love helped supported the organizers on the ground and propelled marriage equality to victory. How Black Lives Matter, even just the last few years, has changed our perceptions of racial justice and policing. Even Asian American was a narrative intervention. It started as an alternative to Oriental that initially spoke to a set of values and ideas rooted in justice and solidarity. And there's so many AAPI groups beginning to use narrative strategy now to advocate for ideas like solidarity or to combat disinformation and call for more belonging for AAPI people. We know where we're starting in terms of the dominant and harmful narratives, but we also know that there's alternatives, right? We know that activists and visionaries, some of you who are on this call, are already seeding the deep narratives out in the world that describe where we're going, right? About solidarity, about community care, and a sense of interdependence, pride, belonging, and self-determination. So this framework that I have up on this slide, I know it's a ton of text, but it's called a narrative system. And it shows where we're starting and offers a destination for our narrative work so that we can move beyond just shifting a single idea or narrative. And more importantly, it gives us the freedom to move beyond message discipline, right? We can advance and allow for many different narratives to exist in the ecosystem in different forms and on different timelines. We don't all have to be saying the same thing at the same time. And we believe that building narrative power starts within our own communities. Again, not only have our communities internalized harmful dominant narratives, but we just can't wait for someone else to tell better stories about us if we don't first know what those stories are. And we think that Millennial and Gen Z Asian Americans will be at the forefront of this. In fact, they already are. Yes, this is a picture from one of our grantees, Hmong Innovating Politics. We love them. And also, like, if we believe that millennials and Gen Zs are leading the way, we needed to learn more about them. Understanding your audience is one of the most important pieces of narrative strategy. And we're seeing, more research about AAPI communities, but there's still very, very little that we know, especially about these key generations. So we wanted to close that gap with our research. So we spoke directly and heard directly from our audience across 200 survey responses, a lot of which we garnered from Instagram or TikTok. We interviewed 28 people from that sample and developed 6 audience personas that I'll show in a minute. Our goal wasn't to have the most representative sample based on ethnicity, but to have broad representation of factors that we don't always hear so much from, to make sure we are hearing from groups like Southeast Asians, Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, having a broad representation of gender diversity, sexuality, class background, generation, etc. And I'll note that it was really important to us to make this an AAPI process to include Native Hawaiian and Pacifica people in our survey. And I'm really excited because we're kicking off an additional community-specific NHPI narrative research process to really honor that not all narratives and experiences are the same and overlap perfectly within the AAPI umbrella. And one thing that was really interesting to us from our survey responses was that actually the demographics weren't statistically significant in predicting how people felt about issues or about their identities. What was more predictive was people's experiences. So their perception of discrimination, economic mobility, immigrant generation, those had a lot more salience in distinguishing how people felt. So I wanted to dive further into this in our interviews. And in our process, we are also supported by some amazing experts across research, narrative strategy, civic and political engagement, so that we could make sure our research was useful and applicable to the movement. So what did we find? Again, our goal was not just to learn how to close the gaps between dominant and aspirational narratives, but also how to better understand who could help us do that and who would we need to engage if we want to build this majority. So we came up with 6 personas that describe how people relate to their identity and as an experience as an AAPI person. Now, there's a couple ways to look at these. On one hand, I really want us to recognize that everyone has room to grow and transform, and everyone has a role to play if we're going to build that powerful AAPI majority that we want to see. And we also need to recognize that not everyone has adopted the aspirational narratives that we see as the future for our communities. And so some groups have more room to move than others. Now, as I'm describing these people, I would love to get your feedback. Throw an emoji, drop in the chat if these personas resonate with you, if you feel like you know somebody who meets them, or if you know, or if you think that they describe yourself. So let us know. So let's talk about who has room to move. On the left, we have our pragmatic strivers. These are your Kevin Nguyen's. They're people who aspire to opportunity and meritocracy, and they have a real need for security because they want their hard work to be recognized and celebrated. They can be really sensitive to feeling like anti-Asian violence isn't getting the attention it deserves. I heard many strivers be really concerned that all their Asian friends knew what was happening to elders, but none of their white coworkers, and that made them feel really discouraged. This group tends to be more politically moderate, although they do fall along the political spectrum. they might feel like progressive ideas sound really nice, but they're just not realistic. And so instead, they tend to focus on personal achievement to get ahead. But they are loud, they're proud, they're so excited about things like representation, and we need them to rally their friends and bring their passion to the movement. In the middle, we have our compassionate peacekeepers. They were some of my favorite conversations to have because they're so relational and genuine. This group aspires to belonging in dominant culture. They just want everyone to get along, and tend to be a bit less politicized, I would say. That said, they do know that racism is real, but they'll prefer to focus on one-to-one action over a political or systemic change, because again, their lens is just not there. It's on a more relational, interpersonal level. So we need them to see both sides and help bring people into the fold to grow our movement and make space for those who might be earlier in our journey. And this group tends to skew a bit older and oftentimes feel very motivated and connected to their faith. On the right, we have independent skeptics. This group tends to be younger. They feel different. They might hold multiple marginalized identities, and they really crave recognition of that. So for example, I heard from one queer Muslim woman who said they didn't know that people like her existed outside of the internet until they went to college. They tend to be more progressive on issues, but they can feel alienated by the API community, especially sometimes by people with the striver persona. And they can help us make inclusion a reality. Then in terms of those who are already sharing aspirational narratives, we have on the left and in the middle are inclusive optimists and cultural experimentalists. I typically find that a lot of people in the nonprofit ecosystem fall into one of these categories. So inclusive optimists, they aspire to pan-API inclusion. They really see inherent value in diversity, and they think more is more when it comes to difference, as long as there's equal representation. So they'll join the API student groups, and also they've been on a journey to from potentially feeling more isolated or feeling some shame about their identity to feeling so much more proud lately, and they really want to create structure and spaces for others to go on that journey too. In the middle, we have cultural experimentalists. They're really focused on evolution and change, and they feel really, really connected to their heritage, but they're also innovators. So they see a distinct need to leave some things behind and evolve culture to meet the moment. So these are the ones you'll find leading mutual aid groups. They're the chefs rebranding Chinese American food to be something we should celebrate, and that came out of a really unique immigration experience in US history. They're practicing solidarity. And part of their evolution can mean or include interrogating things like anti-Blackness or wanting to normalize mental health. And then on the right, we have Rooted in Heritage. This is a group that's very focused on their own communities. So think Native Hawaiian activists who are fighting for land, language, and self-governance. Or I know some people in Taiwanese American communities who are preserving identity, language, and heritage, Japanese American orgs like Densho. This group is very focused on preserving their sense of heritage and identity. So they will be on the same page as other parts of the API umbrella sometimes, but our challenge is to bring them into the fold while not forcing them to always have the same opinions or put the same priorities first. Now, again, everyone has a seat at the table and everyone has a role to play. I think cultural experimentalists tend to be the ones who are modeling and being examples for all of us who are are driving the conversation forward and helping us imagine what a new version of API America looks, feels, and sounds like. But they may need to be reminded that not everybody is at the same point in their journey. And that's where strivers and peacekeepers can do a lot to bring people in. Now, all of our personas have all of this rich detail that could be helpful to your own work. So do reach out to us if you think that could be helpful. Now, I know I threw a lot of descriptions at you. I just want to give touch real quickly on like how you might apply this using an example that we are working on this spring. So one issue that's been out in the wild in conversation a lot is about education equity. We know that stereotypically and perhaps in real life, Asian Americans are notoriously passionate about education. And this is an issue with widely divergent views. So if you want an example of how Asian Americans are not a monolith, this is it. And the focus of the education conversation this year has been very much around elite school admissions. So like whether you can use race as a factor to get in, there's a Supreme Court case about this right now, or whether things like standardized tests are the best way to decide who gets into an elite public high school. So how are different personas seeing this issue? Well, groups like strivers or peacekeepers, they've been very susceptible to the idea that removing race will help Asian Americans get ahead and that there's only a few schools that will allow us to achieve success. And we want to celebrate and acknowledge their passion and the fact that they haven't always had an easy time achieving that success and finding alternatives, because these ideas are rooted in scarcity and assimilation. And we know that assimilation hasn't always guaranteed us the success or safety that we want. On another side of the spectrum, we have inclusive optimists who might believe in affirmative action, for example, but because of the model minority myth, don't always see how Asian Americans benefit, especially if they grew up in the middle class. But regardless, you know, education equity is about so much more than Harvard, and Asian Americans, especially those from poor and working class backgrounds, have a lot to gain from policies that can make education more equitable. So whether we're Black or brown or Asian, we all deserve access to this. And especially Asian American communities, we want to make sure that they're involved in shaping what an equitable education system looks like. So we'll be doing some message testing this spring to learn how to move the conversation beyond elite schools so that our communities can be actively involved in shaping the kind of education system that we want to see. Now, I'll leave you with one last thought that's a bit more future oriented. I mentioned the cultural experimentalist persona, the persona that is actively involved in reimagining and reshaping our sense of culture and identity. And I actually had an activity where I asked people to bring in images that describe the best of Asian America, or Pacifica or Native Hawaiian America, depending on how somebody identified. And for Asian America, this is what people showed me. You know, these are all images of innovation, experimentation, things that take the best of our cultures of origin and mix it up, remix it to fit our context now. You know, so you see here images of food, entrepreneurs, artists, musicians, even roots in the Asian American movement, the fight for mental health recognition, ideas that are the direct product of living here and only here in the diaspora. And all of these were such points of pride for our audience across all personas. So we really have so much in common in terms of what we desire for the future. The problem is that nobody is recognizing this. And our narrative work, when we consider these differences in perspective and orient ourselves towards these aspirational narratives that we shared, can do a lot to reframe this experimentation that you see here, away from some bad Asian version of our parents' culture, something I've heard personally a lot, to really loudly and proudly say, this is who we are as Asian Americans. Our experience and our identity is a direct product of solidarity, of innovation, and sharing the best of our cultures of origin to create something that's new and innovative here. And narrative can help accelerate this shift across the movement and offer support for so many of the things that activists and experimentalists are doing in movements and in culture. So I hope that you can consider this as something, as a destination, as an aspiration for where we want to head together. Now, I'm going to open it up for questions, and I know there's been a lot of chatter in the chat. We really hope that these personas can be useful to you all, and that they can have a lot of applications. We certainly are seeing them in electoral work, in policy work, in narrative work, but we would love to hear from you, how you would like to bring more audience specificity and better audience understanding into your work, and what kind of capacity would help you apply these or strengthen your ability to apply them. So do reach out to us, do let us know. We would love to work and partner with you on this, and we're so curious to hear your thoughts. So thank you so much for listening. We are going to open it up for questions now.
Round of applause for Kana. Let's get some reactions going on. Woot woot. All right, Kana, we have a couple of logistic questions. First of all, if you don't mind going over the survey methodology one more time, just in case folks had missed it, whether it was an interview, et cetera, right?
Yes. So this is a kind of a mixed method process, and informed by my background in design research and design thinking. I was trained in this at the Stanford D School. So first we collected 200 survey responses, and then we did 20 interviews based on that. I did do some light regression analysis to just come up with what felt salient from the surveys, but it is a small sample. And so I didn't want to lean too heavily on those results. I wanted to focus more on the qualitative and fill in some of those experience questions that are so tricky to answer in any other way. And then creating personas was a product of those qualitative interviews. I have this process that involves a lot of Post-it notes, etc.
Awesome. And there was a question about the contrast of what is a dominant narrative versus an aspirational narrative. How did you go about defining those?
Yeah. Oh, and I do see one question about breaking out Asian Americans and NHPIs, and then I'll touch on the dominant and aspirational narrative. So in our personas, we included everybody. I will say that demographically, there are a number of NHPI people who land in this rooted in heritage bucket because of the way the conversation is, especially all the activism coming out of Native Hawaii, led by Native Hawaiians coming out of Hawaii. But in general, people cut across and could be found in all of these buckets. So they're not demographic specific. We are kicking off a separate community-specific research process to expand this work to fit Native Hawaiian and Pacifica communities. We'll be kicking that off pretty soon. So I'm really, really excited to see and to honor where the differences are and where there's overlaps in terms of the umbrella. Okay, let's go back to the narratives. So these dominant narratives on the left are ones that I did a landscape research scan and noticed that these ones kept coming to the top in terms of the what were the things guiding the dominant ways people were talking about Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in public. And then the aspirational narratives were the same themes that kept coming up over and over again that seemed to be sourced more from activist or experimentalist spaces. So these are the ones that the aspirational narratives are the ones that again provide a destination for our work. We want our narrative work that we lead or our grantees lead to be rooted in this future, so that whether we're advocating for a specific policy or trying to hold an elected official to account, or launching a campaign to help people feel proud of, say, an Asian American identity, we're tying back up to these aspirational narratives and giving them legs so that we can start building and shaping that culture that we want to see.
Okay, this question came through the chat. Based on your conversations and interviews, where are millennials and Gen Z getting their political education from?
That's a good question. And something actually our team is really curious about, and we have another research project that we are kicking off to learn how to engage, especially those who aren't involved with movement organizations right now. I see something in the chat, TikTok lols, that's probably right. I know for me personally, I learn a lot on Instagram, and we know that our feeds can be pretty siloed. So there's definitely, we think there's a huge need for just more political education in general.
Okay, Suman had a question in terms of what our future plans look like for sharing the message testing and methodology.
Yes, so as I mentioned, we'll be doing some message testing around education equity this spring. We know there's a Supreme Court decision coming out in June, and so we want people to feel prepared to respond to that. So likely we will be creating a toolkit and circulating that. But this message testing is kind of just the start. We're experimenting with a specific tool that I've used before called Grow Progress. But we do see opportunity to do some additional testing around our aspirational narratives to help decide, like, where should we start? How do people feel about these? Are these just ideas that only activists care about, etc.?
Paige asks a really good question. Did the term Asian American feel like a salient identity to your participants, and what was the discussion there?
Yes. So this one is super, super interesting. And I know there's been a lot of debate about whether this term is even relevant anymore. So inclusive optimists and cultural experimentalists, they definitely knew about the Asian American movement and knew that that term came from that history. So someone pointed out there is a picture from Ghidra magazine on the image that came from those personas. I think strivers, peacekeepers, and well, skeptics probably, some of them know. Strivers and peacekeepers tend to see the term as just kind of a default. Sometimes I even hear, maybe from some cultural experimentalists, that this is a term that flattens us. So I don't have a big stake in the ground in terms of what term we should use, but there is definitely opportunity to let people know the history of where this came from, and the fact that, and to balance like the sense of pride in our diversity and to honor our differences without becoming so divisive that we lose our power and strength in numbers.
Okay, Terry has a longer question. Can you speak more about authenticity as a dominant narrative for Asian Americans and not for PIs? And it goes on to share about how authenticity sometimes gets deployed as a marker for lived experience for creators and wide range of IDs that they inhabit rather than reinforcing a culture of tradition. So curious your thoughts on what the authenticity piece of it all means for folks, Kana.
Yes. And so first, this is where I'm really excited to do the narrative landscape research for PI communities so that we just get a better understanding of like how much do these how much is shared and where might there be distinction. So I do suspect, and I did hear from interviewees that actually authenticity is something that Native Hawaiian and PI communities also experience. So I should update this slide. But as a whole, authenticity, when I say authenticity is a dominant narrative here, you might have heard people say something like, oh, I'm a bad Asian, or something I hear sometimes as a mixed race, 4th generation Japanese American woman is, you're a white Asian, you're our white friend. And so there's definitely a balance and a difference between authenticity as being true to yourself, speaking your truth, having a range of stories out there that don't just fit the typical mold, and people using authenticity to gatekeep who can be part of a community and whose stories are valid. So when I say authenticity here, it's more the latter, and more the lines that go up to prevent a greater sense of inclusion. Yes, someone's putting in the chat, not being able to speak the language is a big thing, especially in the Japanese American community, which I'm familiar with. You know, our grandparents, it wasn't so cool, right, to be speaking a heritage language back in the day. And now we're seeing people really judged for that, even though the circumstances are different. And it can go both ways too, like calling people a fob also fits within these bounds.
Alrighty, next question. Did you hear anything about what millennial, Gen Z, or alphas do to reconcile, quote, in culture oppression, whether it's historical or current, like Taiwanese folks not identifying as Chinese, for example?
Yes. So these are where our friends, the cultural experimentalists, are really leading on this. So things you hear from them, for example, are like, we don't want to see trauma and confuse that for culture. They're very much advocating for more mental health. They have Instagram accounts about this. There's one for parents called Untigering. And then all of I think the music and creative expression is also a way to push back against the authenticity. So in terms of what they're doing, I think the conversation around how to address this is much more challenging. Not everybody feels comfortable like going right to their parents or having the language skills to do this in a way that is effective. And so I think doing this is hard, and there's a real need to bring this conversation beyond just the scope of the family.
This is like the question that is that our entire lives are focused on. How do millennials and Gen Zs find their way into activists and political spaces and organizations? This may take longer than the time allotted.
That's a $1 million question. We'll be doing some additional research on this spring and summer, actually. So we're excited to share more about that. I do think that, and one reason why we even did persona research is because we suspect that some personas are much better reached and finding their way to activist spaces on their own. And other personas, it's not on their radar, or sometimes they feel alienated by these spaces, right? So inclusive optimists, cultural experimentalists, even to some extent, independent skeptics are already getting there. They're finding the resources on Instagram, following the accounts. They have friends who will pull them in. Something that I'm noticing, though, especially in the wake of so much anti-Asian violence, is that pragmatic strivers and compassionate peacekeepers are getting really involved too, and they're creating their own spaces. Peacekeepers, I tend to see, there's a number of organizations that volunteer and patrol around Chinatown. They volunteer at self-defense workshops. They'll do translation to help with language skills. All of that is so necessary. Pragmatic strivers have been raising a ton of money for mutual aid and to support victims of violence. And we also see that there's a pretty big gap. Movement organizations don't necessarily have the relationships with these newcomers, and the newcomers don't know how much they could learn from these movement organizations, or may not be as comfortable with how political they tend to be. So we're really, really curious about how we bridge this. As we learn more, we want to let you know, and also would be curious what others have noticed or learned as they try to do this too.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is I think there's a lot of implications also for grassroots organizations that are on the ground working, right? Like not only trying to understand the ways they're finding us, but actually like also what reasons why they are avoiding some of our movement organizations. What we need to be doing cohesively and collectively to bring more folks under the umbrella to advance those types of narratives. That's right. I'm gonna keep going along. Do we have any sense of how these personas and frames have commonalities or synergies with other communities of color? Like, for example, are there areas where Venn diagrams with other communities of color in the same demographics could overlap?
Yes. So I haven't looked into this specifically, and definitely need to do more sharing with other friends of color who are involved in activist work to understand where those overlaps are. And actually, as we dive into our NHPI research, this will give us some clues as well. So on one hand, these personas are meant to be attitudinal. They're reflective of how people see their identity. So if you look at like the level of detail and around these different categories, they do seem pretty specific to an API experience. That said, inclusive optimists, for example, who value diversity for diversity's sake are probably the ones who join like the pan-ethnic, cross-racial solidarity efforts. And I'm sure that there's people like them in other communities. I also know that like with strivers or peacekeepers, we've seen iterations of those amongst other communities as well. And same with cultural experimentalists. I think those are activists no matter what. But I know a lot less about like if they were in the Latina community, for example, what would it sound like? How would a pragmatic striver sound different than a cultural experimentalist?
This one hits a little bit closer home as I have to purge my mom's Facebook accounts. Are conspiracy theories and those that are friendly to authoritarian regimes starting to creep in among Gen Z and millennials? Are we starting to see any of that in the folks that you talk to?
So I think I will say that the ones who uphold these kinds of things were a bit harder to reach. I suspect, especially as we get to older generations, there is probably like an extension of a pragmatic driver that's really into those ideas right now. Not just believing them, because a lot of people are susceptible to it. It's not anyone's fault. But the ones like really pushing for that. Where I start to see it is like with men's rights, Asians. There's definitely some groups who are just more authoritarian and lean more into those kinds of male dominant expressions in their activism. So I definitely think it's a thing, it's a concern. It doesn't seem yet to have the same magnitude or level of concern as it does when people talk about this amongst their parents. And I think being able to communicate in the same language has something about that, right? Like part of what can be scary about this topic for our elders or our grandparents is that like we might know what's happening, but we don't always have the language skills to have a conversation or know what to do about it. I think if it's our friends or, you know, something even that I'm reading on Reddit, like I can just comprehend it so much more easily if it's in English.
There's been a lot of asks about what folks can do to collaborate or where there's opportunities in the future. What could that potentially look like for us, Kana?
Yeah. So we would love to find ways for people to experiment with these personas, and we are happy to have a call with you, provide some kind of light support. Let me pull up the link again. We put a little doc together with some ideas already baked. But if you have a campaign coming up, or if you're hoping to expand and reach a different audience, or there's an audience you're reaching, but you think you could just like support them a little bit better, you know, we would love to hear from you and talk about how these personas might be able to help. I also know a lot more about these different personas than what fits on a slide. So I always love having conversations with people about what they're working on, how they're integrating narrative strategy, or how they're trying to think about audiences with more complexity.
We have a fun question about the Gen Xers in all of this. What are you seeing any overlaps in terms of what lessons we can learn from the analysis about Gen Y and Gen Z that tells us anything about what Gen X and how that could play out?
Yeah. So this is something that comes up on our own team. We have some Gen Xers in our staff, on our board. I do think, and I am curious to hear from others, like how much they think the personas extend beyond just the Gen Z and millennial generations. Again, they're attitudinal, and so there's a lot more opportunity. I definitely know peacekeepers and strivers who are in Gen X and boomer generations, also for cultural experimentalists and inclusive optimists and rooted in heritage as well. So I think it's less about like, do they hold up or not, but like, what are the nuances where you start to see differences, or where more specificity for a specific generation or any other demographic marker might be important.
I know we're slated to go for another half hour, but I wanted to make a quick additional call for questions in the chat. I don't mind giving folks back some time. As we're waiting for those questions, Kana, what was your experience going through this process? Curious, like what your main takeaways were from talking to folks. How did it feel going through and talking to folks?
Yeah. So I've done a lot of qualitative research before. I've never done qualitative research where I could have been one of the research subjects or like fit within this bucket. And so on one hand, I felt like I was able to connect with people in a way that was really special. It was also a much more emotional process than I had ever experienced before. So often, you know, as a researcher, you're supposed to be unbiased, you're supposed to be objective, which I don't actually believe any of that is possible. But I found that my role changed so much from just being a listener to somebody who had an opportunity to help people feel heard and hold space for questions and things people were wrestling with. They also didn't feel like they had an outlet. So the sense of grief and isolation and longing for community was something that was really, really palpable. There is so much opportunity. People really want to see a new future for API communities, and there is so much need. I think if we build those spaces, people really will come.
We have one tiny last question. Are there voting rates for each of these personas?
I don't have those specifically, but I did. So there is an audience segmentation called from something called the Narrative Observatory, and let me just pull the link. I asked people to take their quiz so that our personas can map to them. I've worked a lot with Harmony Labs in other projects outside the Asian American space. I'm hoping to work with them in the future. But if you go to their website, there's a lot of cultural consumption data on, and even down to like playlists, Twitter feeds. So they'll be able to tell you more about voting rates. They have 4 personas, we have 6. If you're curious about diving in deeper there, email me and I can tell you more about how to translate between them.
Sounds good. I'm like looking through the chat. Just a lot of kudos for you, Kana. Thank you so much for today's discussion. Really thank you to everybody for dropping their questions in there. I'm going to give you the last word, Kana, as we wrap up.
Yeah. Let me refresh. I forgot to add my email to the slide. But again, we would love to hear from you. Whether you want to collaborate, whether you have additional questions. I know there was a question about which survey questions were asked. I'm happy to spend more time with people to share our process or talk about how it might fit yours as well. And in the meantime, you know, do keep us updated. If you have feedback on the personas, if you have tried using them and have some thoughts about how it went, we would love to know. And in the meantime, you know, I hope that this gives you a slightly different way to think about and a more expansive way to think about our communities and gives you some hope for the amazing future that we can build together. So thank you.